Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. For my returning subscribers, welcome back my feline friends. If you are new here, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. We are doing 2 cases in this week's video. This week's cases are both unsolved, but it seems like the perpetrators are known. Now, our first case was a recommendation by Athena Snyder, so thank you, Athena. It deals with a 15-year-old girl who was found dead in Arkansas over 30 years ago, and this case is still considered ongoing. So, let's get started. Brandy Dawn Hutchinson was born on November 5th, 1974. Now, her parents had divorced and her mother lived out of state in Iowa, and Brandy stayed with her father in Clarksville, Arkansas. It was reported that Brandy had a pretty rough life as her family lived in poverty, but Brandy was smart and a kind person who made friends pretty easily. Despite her rough life, she was always smiling and happy. However, she did get bored easily, and that would get her in some trouble. At the time, Brandy actually wasn't attending school. She had been kicked out, and she was on a waiting list to join a alternative school, and she just hadn't been accepted yet. There isn't a lot of information out there leading up to the night that Brandy was killed, but here is what I was able to piece together. The night Brandy was killed, it was right after her 15th birthday, so her friends were apparently throwing a party for her. Brandy's father had dropped her off at the location on November 10th, 1988. Now, the location was actually this abandoned house, and it was known as the old John Emery house. When she was dropped off, no one was there, but Brandy went ahead and told her dad, just go on home. I'm sure somebody will show up shortly. Now, Brandy was supposed to stay with her boyfriend that night. Apparently they were going to drive to Iowa to see her mother that weekend. So her dad had no idea that was the last time that he'd see his daughter. 2 days later, Brandy's body was found in the basement of the abandoned house by 2 hunters. The 2 hunters had lost their hunting dogs and were searching for them and thought they heard him in the house, so they searched the house and went into the cellar of the house, and that's where they found Brandy buried in a shallow grave. An autopsy would confirm that she was shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol right between the eyes. It was noted that she may not have died right away either, that she was more likely paralyzed and passed away up to 30 minutes later. They do not believe that she was sexually assaulted because she was fully clothed. Now, inside the house, there were a lot of satanic symbols and, dark symbols like 666 and KKK, and there was also red rum written all over the walls, but authorities did not believe this was related. Those symbols were probably there prior to Brandy's murder because this house was a well-known property for teens to go and party in. But all the same, back then, people loved to blame things like this on a satanic cult. Now, many people believe that the investigation was not done correctly at all. People that knew Brandy and were her best friends and even who had been with her that day were never questioned by police or asked for interviews. There are claims that evidence may not have been collected correctly, and allegedly Brandy had some blonde hair in her fist that may or may not have been tested for DNA. Now, like I said before, Brandy did have a boyfriend, and he was 17 years old. His name was Mark, and his family lived not too far from the abandoned house. And some believe that he was actually responsible for what happened. The motive? Well, apparently Brandy was pregnant and was going to tell Mark about it that night. Now, apparently she had already told her dad that she was pregnant, and she was asking her dad for permission to marry Mark. But her dad told her no because she was only 15. So that weekend, Brandy was planning on visiting her mother and asking her mother's permission to marry Mark. You guys are obsessed with my microphone. However, at Brandy's autopsy, it was determined that she in fact was not pregnant. Now, there is a rumor, and I cannot substantiate this, but the rumor is that Brandy and one of her friends took pregnancy tests together. Brandy's pregnancy test was negative, but her friend's was positive, and her friend had switched the tests in some sort of denial. So if that rumor is true, Brandy really did think she was pregnant. There was also a person that was friends with Mark's older sister, and the night that Brandy was murdered, that friend was spending the night with Mark's older sister at their house. Both the girls were staying up late and just fooling around, and that's when Mark came in about after midnight and said he was looking really freaked out, and he just walked by them, walked into his room, and shut the door. It was then stated that shortly after Brandy's body was discovered, Mark's family just kind of up and moved. Now, authorities have stated several times that they have a pretty good idea on who committed this act, but the problem is they do not have any evidence to charge that person. They won't say the name, but I'm assuming it's Mark. Now, in a weird twist, somebody had reported, again, I cannot substantiate this, but somebody had reported that years later, Mark had actually been arrested for another murder that was similar to Brandy's. But I have scoured the internet searching for this, and I cannot find that case anywhere. So unknown if that is true or not. Now, lastly, the state medical examiner that was in office at the time of Brandy's murder was corrupt as hell. In short, his bizarre and asinine rulings would allow a lot of people to get away with murder very easily for many years. Now, it was alleged that while in office, besides his asinine death rulings, is that he would testify erroneously in trial cases, and that his rulings were often reversed by juries and outside pathologists that challenged his findings. And this happened on a regular basis. Now, the biggest controversy surrounding him at the time was around Bill Clinton, who was the state governor, who went on to be president. Apparently, Bill Clinton's mother was a nurse, and a patient died under her care. Due to this state examiner's ruling, she was able to avoid being responsible for the death of the patient. Now, I'm not saying she was guilty. I'm not saying that the ruling was bad. It just was a lot of controversy surrounding it at the time. Now, when Bill Clinton ran for president, this state medical examiner was asked to resign, which he did. But don't worry, he got a nice, cushy state job with a nice salary. Now, the house where Brandy's body was found suspiciously burned to the ground shortly after the murder, where only the foundation was left. There is also a Facebook page called Justice for Brandy Hutchins that is very much active today. And if you may have any information about this case, please call the Johnson County Sheriff in Arkansas at the number on the screen. Let's hope Brandy finds the justice that is due to her soon. Now, our next case deals with the Coulthurst family, who was brutally murdered on their very expensive fishing boat, and it was one of the worst crimes considered in Alaska. The Coulthurst family came from a very long line of fishermen. Like, this is their livelihood for many generations. John and Sally Coulthurst purchased a 58-foot fishing boat for $800,000, and named it the Investor. They named their son Mark as co-owner and skipper of the boat. So Mark would run the boat and the business, and his parents, John and Sally, would just share in the profits. Now, in the summer of 1982, Mark, who was 28 years old, along with his wife, who was also 28 years old, and their 2 children, Kimberly, who was 5, and John, who was 4, would set off on a summer of fishing. They also brought along with them 4 other crew members to serve as deckhands. There was Michael Stewart, who was Mark's cousin. He was 19 years old. There was Dean Moon and Jerome Kiwan, who were both 19, and Chris Heyman, who was 18 years old. Now, Mark had been a fisherman pretty much all his life. That's really all he did, and he was successful at it. He would often boast that in the summer of 1979, he caught $105,000 worth of fish, which helped his family live a pretty cush life. Now, Mark was also known to have a cocky attitude and a quick temper, which often got him into some scuffles every now and then. So, after a long summer of fishing, on September 5th of 1982, the family docked the boat right outside of a small Alaskan town called Craig. Now, the next day, residents started seeing smoke billowing from the boat. So nearby vessels attempted, to give aid, but they were unable to board the boat because the flames quickly overtook it and created this inferno. It took authorities 4 hours to douse the flames enough for them to actually board the boat. It would take another 2 days before they completely extinguished everything. So once authorities were aboard the boat, they found human remains which were very badly burned. Through dental records and several days, they were able to determine that Mark, his wife Irene, their daughter Kimberly, and Mark's cousin Michael were deceased. Days later, they would find more human remains in a different part of the ship, who they assumed were Dean, Jerome, and Chris, the other deckhands. But the bodies were so charred that some of them were actually nothing but ash. They found some teeth, some bones, and 1 human torso. So Dean and Chris were never fully positively identified as being one of the bodies on the boat. They also assumed that John, Mark and Irene's 4-year-old son, was in the part of the boat where the fire started and was the hottest, so no remains were never found of him. Autopsies were performed on the intact bodies, and they determined that they were shot and were dead before the fire started, due to no carbon dioxide being in their lungs. The fire was intentionally set as well, as gasoline was poured all over the boat. When witnesses were questioned, many stated they saw a man driving the Investor's skiff back to shore before the fire was noticed. And this man, they stated, was recognized as John Peel, who was 23 years old. Now, John Peel had been on Mark's crew since 1980, but in 1982, shortly before Mark took off on his latest fishing trip, he had to fire John because of John's alcohol and drug use. John had also dated Mark's sister for a time, and she broke up with him. Now, authorities would bring John in for questioning and give him a polygraph test. He stated that he was nowhere near the Investor and that he was actually on land when all this supposedly went down, but he failed the polygraph test. Authorities would continue questioning witnesses around the town, and they would learn that one skipper on a nearby vessel stated that they saw John aboard the Investor the night of the murders, and he knew it was John because they both waved at each other. Another witness stated that he had sold John about 3 to 4 big jugs of gasoline hours before the fire was started. And many people would tell authorities that there was bad blood between John and Mark due to his firing. The problem is authorities had no physical evidence to put John on the boat. So they would continue investigating for the next 2 years until they finally thought they had enough evidence and arrested John on first-degree murder and first-degree arson. But the entire case was purely circumstantial. So in March of 1986, John's trial began. Prosecutors say that the motive was that John was so angry he was fired that he flew into a rage, shot the family, and then set the boat on fire to cover his crime. John's attorney would state that since Dean and Chris could never be positively identified that they were victims of this crime, that they could have very well been the perpetrators and simply escaped. The trial went on for 6 months until the jury finally came back and they were hung, and the trial ended up in a mistrial. So in January of 1998, another trial began for John. This time the trial lasted 3 months, and after 4 days of deliberation, the jury came back and acquitted John of all charges. Now, after his acquittal, John would go on to sue the state for wrongful prosecution for $177 million, but he settled for $900,000 in the end. So Alaska authorities have been quoted in saying that they're not looking for another killer, that as far as they're concerned, the case is closed. They felt that they had the right guy, he was just too good at covering up the crime. Former Bellingham, Washington police detective David McNeil, he helped investigate this crime, has stated, just because someone is acquitted does not mean that they are innocent. It just means that there is not enough evidence to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There is speculation that there may have been another motive for the family murders, and that the investor was known to be a drug boat, and what happened was a drug deal gone bad. But other authorities have dismissed this as ludicrous. So for many years, Mark's sister had believed that John Peel was the guilty party in this. However, John agreed to meet with her years later and answer her questions. And after that meeting, she states that she doesn't necessarily believe anymore that John pulled the trigger, but she does believe that he knows more than he's admitting to. So what are your thoughts on these two unsolved cases? Do you think Brandy's boyfriend Mark was responsible? Do you think John was responsible for taking the lives aboard the investor? Or do you think maybe Dean and Chris were involved and were able to make their escape and live on undetected all this time? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button, and I will be back next week with another true crime case or mystery. Thanks, guys.